Welcome to Zero Trust World 2025. CyberRisk TV is here, recording live from the Caribe Royale in Orlando, Florida. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me to help kick off our second day of coverage of the conference is my good friend and fellow podcast host, Jackie McGuire. Welcome, Jackie.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's had a lot of great conversations yesterday. And yeah, I think that's one of the great things about these conferences is the hallway con, the conversations that come out of it, and that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And yeah, just chatting before we went live, I think the first thing I want to talk about is, and I hate that I'm saying this, AI. But now that we're at Zero Trust World, and we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about what is Zero Trust? How is it implemented? How does it apply in different scenarios and situations? And then we have AI on the other side.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this on the podcast a couple days ago, where the FTC, some of the biggest fines they've been handing out have been for companies collecting too much data on customers. Yeah. But then we see these breaches of data brokers, and like the whole model is to collect as much data as possible.
Yeah.
And segueing into AI, that's also kind of the model. Like the more value you get out of it comes from feeding it more data, giving it access to more data.
Yeah.
So how do we bring Zero Trust and AI together without destroying the value of AI?
Yeah, because I think in the enterprise, we really rely on human judgment with data, right? So we have categories of data. Most people in an enterprise know what PII is, but then you rely a lot on people's judgment in terms of, oh, this is a sensitive piece of data. This is not, this can be stored on my endpoint. This needs to be stored in a secure cloud drive. But when it comes to AI only knows what you tell it. And despite us trying to anthropomorphize it and make it this, living assistant, it only does what you tell it to do. It doesn't have judgment. It can't say, oh, this is actually an unhashed session token sitting in a model that shouldn't be here. So I think Zero Trust is a really pertinent thing to talk about right now because agentic AI is this new, this is the new thing. And essentially what we found out is that you can't just use a handyman for everything in the enterprise, right? So these kind of general models don't work. So everybody's creating these agents that are all kind of specialized in different steps in the process. But then those agents all need to be given access to data. And sometimes in one model, you have 20 different agents that need access to different sets of data. So, Zero Trust becomes especially important when you say, okay, how do we give least privilege access? How do we maintain the access of all of these agents to the data they need to do their job, but make sure that if one of them really spins out of control, we have circuit breakers and way to kind of contain that fallout and contain where that data goes. And so I think we're still starting to sort that out, but everything in the world is kind of pertinent to AI now, and I think Zero Trust is one of those things that I've been particularly focused on because we're starting to see parts of the enterprise that don't typically handle sensitive data implement AI, and maybe they don't intuitively know that, oh, this data is classified this way and our data retention policy says I can only hold it for 90 days, right? So I think, I hate that we're always talking about AI, but just like any employee, if you're going to rapidly staff up, you have to find a way to control that access and limit the fallout.
Yeah, and even the way Microsoft approached this with Copilot makes sense, but it's still kind of broken in a way. They said, okay, Copilot's just going to have access to whatever that employee has access to.
Yeah.
So now there doesn't need to be this Copilot service account that has access to the entire organization, because obviously somebody's going to go after that service account, this thing that has access to all data. But at the same time, because data hygiene is an issue, like if you were to look at my downloads folder, you'd probably find a picture of my passport, you'd find customer confidential data from clients that I'm working with. Like just everything goes into the download folder. Yeah. It's just a mess. And zoom out to the enterprise level, and nobody's thinking, okay, this data is this, so it needs to go here, or I need to apply this Microsoft Purview data label to it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, at the same time, people trying out Copilot are finding, there are sensitive access tokens on SharePoint just hanging out. Like I've had access to it all this time, but I didn't know until I typed a prompt into Copilot, and it was like, hey, you want to see some passwords?
Yeah. Well, and I think we've all, maybe not all of us, but I used to love a good Google Drive exploration, right?
Oh,
Like I
yeah.
used to love a
As
good,
a pen
you know,
tester, that's how I used to train pen testers.
or just
Once
as a
you get
nosy
access to
employee.
files, yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of like you'll find that sometimes executives prepare things for the board and then save
Oh,
them in drives that they shouldn't. And so, but to your point, like AI, and we talked about this a few weeks ago on the podcast, but there's a difference between better and faster. And so what AI can do is it can crawl data much faster than you can. And so to your point, like a lot of data breaches originate from data that an organization didn't even know it was sitting on, right? And God, you were talking about your downloads folder, and I was just like panicking because I was thinking, my last enterprise laptop, there was like my W-2s, health insurance information, claims, because I would go into, health insurance, my own medical claims. So yeah, it's like, how do you make an AI that protects you from your own stupidity? Because that's
and to your point, the Sony Pictures breach created a Deloitte breach.
Yeah.
Because somebody at Sony Pictures had either brought data with them, or Deloitte had given them some data, had all their employees, what their roles were, how much money they made, their salaries. So all of a sudden, you're seeing these stories about women unfairly paid at Deloitte compared to their counterparts, because of the Sony Pictures breach, which is just bizarre. Like nobody could have predicted, Deloitte would be having to spend, how much they're paying employees because Sony Pictures had a breach done by North Korea.
Right. Well, and like a lot of these breaches are also just bad data management policies. So you still see some of the largest companies in the world letting vendors and partners take data out of their organization. So instead of creating, an ID within the organization that you have visibility and control to, you just let them take sensitive data out.
It's a lot of work, right?
Well,
like you want to put security controls around data. Okay, now I need you to download and install this application. Once you're done with that, I'll give you a passphrase, and then you'll be able to decrypt the file. Like these are how some of these old solutions used to be, and there are probably some better ones today, where maybe you can view but you can't download. But maybe you're relying on JavaScript controls in the browser. I don't know, but yeah, it's tough. It's versus anyone with a link.
Yeah. Well, and unless you're really sure about your partner and vendor's security posture, I don't understand any large company that has cybersecurity awareness allowing sensitive data to be taken out of their architecture. Yes, it's more work to set up vendor accounts within your architecture, and then it becomes your security and access team's problem to manage those and to service these vendors and partners. But the alternative is there's a data breach. You have no idea what data they were still sitting on, no idea how extensive it is, and just I think the level of visibility that we're starting to realize we need because of the systemic risk. We're all connected. To your point with Deloitte, like almost all of the large companies in the world use one of 4 firms. And so if that firm is compromised, you need to know exactly what of your data, it's happened a lot. You need to know which of your data they're holding, and everything in the enterprise is connected now. So we have all these tokens and, session IDs and passwords and things flying around, and still have not found a good way to limit access on a per instance basis to keep people from accessing things that they shouldn't, or doing things with what they've accessed that they shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think it's data. I used to say when I was at 451, when I was an analyst, would be the last data security would be one of the last things that we tackle because of that problem. The moment you start putting controls around things, it's hard to now collaborate with other organizations outside yours. It just makes it more difficult to do things. And we know from the first round of application control companies like Bit9 and stuff like that, it wasn't a bad idea to do application control, which is, kind of the core of what ThreatLocker does, a lot of what they do. It was just a bad implementation of it. They didn't plan for, okay, I've now put this company in exception hell. Like the moment they roll this out, every developer is going to be like, why can't I install this plugin? Why can't I install this application? Like, and organizations just instantly got buried when they tried to apply that across the org. And I think we're going to have that same problem with data. So however the ways maybe that ThreatLocker solved this for application control, maybe some of that we can apply to how we do data control as well.
Yeah, and I think within applications, it's always a trade-off because everything you do to monitor things costs money, right?
Yeah.
Every log you collect, you have to store, you have to process. And so there's always this trade-off of, what's the likelihood something bad's going to happen with this data, and what's the cost of that versus what's the cost to monitor it if nothing happens. And so
That's a good point.
I think CISOs are always tasked with this really hard challenge of trying to explain to the CEO, the CFO, the board that risk avoided is hard to quantify, but it's also really hard to quantify the kind of secondary and tertiary impacts of a breach. So,
Yeah.
Cambridge Analytica is a really good example, right? And like a breach can, for some companies, single-handedly destroy their brand. Other companies, they have a breach and they're just fine. So
Yeah, nobody even realizes it or notices. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think it's always this kind of trade-off between security and, to your point, like accessibility and innovation. And I always like to focus on kind of the disjoint between people, policy, and processes, and that like this is probably a really good policy, application security, but generally the process that it is required to go through to achieve that is what makes people upset. And so they end up attacking the policy when it's not the policy that's bad. So yeah, I think we're getting to a point where we're starting to focus more on the end user experience and realizing that anything that creates friction is going to cause people to try to go around it. And that was one of the really interesting conversations we had yesterday with a table full of CEO or CISOs at lunch, was how much friction should be acceptable in the enterprise in the endeavor to achieve security. And then I always go back to security as a culture. It's not a program, it's not a department, it's not a team, it's not a policy, it's an absolute culture. And so I think that goes back to, how do you frame it for a way for people where they feel like the things you're doing for security are them making a proactive decision to protect their work, their enterprise, all of those things. And so that was kind of, we just went round and around yesterday about, how do you turn friction into like something people want to do because they know they're doing something good. And if anybody figures it out, let me know, because you'll be a billionaire.
So some of the things we were talking about yesterday, I found really helpful. A lot of zero trust is a different way of looking at things. Like typically in the old days, if you asked for permissions to something, or you asked for privileges or access to something, it was chiseled in stone. Like you had that forever. Nobody went back and said, do you still need this? Except maybe if you switched roles within the organization. And even then, a lot of times it didn't happen. But a lot of what we were talking about yesterday, like I installed an app for this conference, for Zero Trust World. I'm not going to need that app on Monday or any day beyond Monday. Next year it's going to be a different version of that app. So that's a very time sensitive thing. So that's like one of the ways we should be thinking about this. Maybe we can give people more access to things if there's some kind of time bound around it. Like I share a file for a meeting. Once that meeting's over, unshare it. The default on sharing files with somebody should be 24 hours maybe. And if I want it longer than that, then I requires an extra step for me to say indefinite, for a year, for a month. So like this idea of temporary access, like maybe this admin only needs like super user privileges for an hour to do something once a month. They shouldn't be carrying around those privileges all the time. So
it's one of those places, I think,
things
AI,
are revocable, in other words.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I think like, we're trying to apply AI and machine learning and stuff to all these solutions, where it's like a basic pattern matching of, does this person usually use this resource? How long has it been since they last accessed it? And like, can we automate giving them access back to this resource if they need it?
Right.
And those things don't require AI. They just require you to understand how people in your company do their jobs. And that is a very, very basic machine learning thing that costs almost nothing to do. And that was the first detection that I wrote at a SIM when I became a data scientist at a SIM, was like, what resources does this person touch, in what order, and how long has it been since they touched them, and how much data usually moves between things when they're working. Because if all of a sudden it goes from megs to gigs, you've got a problem, right? So Yeah, those are things that are somewhat easy to solve, but to your point, until we actually automate them, it's still
Yeah.
something someone has to go in and do. And data lifecycle management should be the default, not
Yeah.
something that, I absolutely agree. Self-destructing files would
Yeah.
be, it's just like Snapchat, right? There's
Well-
some pictures you don't want to live forever.
And we have, yeah, right. And we have information about that, right? Like our systems can tell us nobody's touched this data in 2 years. You really want to keep it?
Yeah.
Maybe you do keep it, but it's archived off on Amazon Glacier. So like it's tucked away somewhere where you could retrieve it if you needed to, but now it's outside the blast radius of, if somebody hacked that account or got in and did something.
Yeah.
And and yeah, even we're seeing it on our phones. Like our phones will say, this app hasn't used a microphone in 2 months, so like we're revoking that privilege.
Yeah.
Like what makes that lower friction and possible to do is it's pretty easy. It takes a couple seconds to add that privilege back.
And to hit allow, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be the key here is, how do we disallow access to data in such a way that we can re-enable it quickly if there's truly a business reason, there's a reason somebody really needs it. I still don't know how we do that for AI though, because that still requires a human to say, no, actually today it does need the microphone.
Yes.
Or today I do need access to this database.
Well, then you have a different AI that's making those decisions.
And that kind of
right?
breaks the whole agentic thing, right? Like the
Yeah.
whole idea that, behind the scenes while we're sleeping, these agents are talking to each other and doing stuff. They need access to all the data all the time. So I don't know how we solve that.
Yeah, neither do I, which is probably why we're doing this and not sitting in a golden castle somewhere.
Right? All right. Thanks for helping me out with the day 2 intro today, Jackie.
More networking. I'll
Yeah.
be out and about, so if you see me around, flag me down. I'd love to talk to everybody who's got ideas.
All right. Make sure you visit securityweekly.com/ZTW for today's live stream schedule and coverage, tomorrow's schedule. I think tomorrow's a half day, and other content related to Zero Trust World 2025. Thanks again, Jackie.
Thanks.